The public narrative of human evolution has been taught like a children's story. Humans evolved in Africa. Around 50,000 years ago, a small group walked out. They replaced everyone else. End of story. This narrative is repeated endlessly in textbooks, documentaries, and middle school classroom lectures because it is easy to understand and easy to illustrate. It is a straight arrow on a map. Africa sits at one end of the arrow and the rest of the world sits at the other. But real human history has never behaved like a classroom diagram. In fact, when scientists begin to examine genomes closely, when they model ancient population history with the full power of modern computational tools, that simple arrow begins to bend, twist, and eventually fracture into something far more complicated. One particularly striking example of this emerging complexity appears in a genetic study titled Ancient Admixture into Africa from the Ancestors of Non-Africans, conducted by researchers from the University of Oxford, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and the University of Pennsylvania. The findings of that study challenge the narrative of a one-way migration out of Africa and suggest instead that human evolution involved a complex web of population movements in multiple directions, including a massive flow of ancestry into Africa from populations that had already spread into North Africa and Eurasia over 150,000 years ago. Incredibly, the study found that up to 50% of many African groups, including West Africans, East Africans and Central Africans, can be traced to an ancient migration into Africa from an early Eurasian population. This was not a recent back migration. This was a migration that started at least 130,000 years ago and peaked 75,000 years ago, just when we are told that there was an out-of-Africa migration. This totally flips the story of human evolution. There isn't even supposed to be a Eurasian population before the out-of-Africa migration, we are told. The central purpose of the research was to investigate demographic events surrounding the so-called out-of-Africa expansion using whole genome data from modern populations. Genetic diversity carries within it the traces of past migrations and population splits, and by analyzing the structure of genomes, it is possible to reconstruct aspects of human demographic history even in the absence of ancient fossils or archaeological artifacts. The researchers developed and applied a computational method that reconstructs genealogical relationships along genomes under a statistical framework known as the coalescent with recombination. This method allows scientists to infer how populations changed in size through time and, crucially, to estimate directional migration rates between populations. Instead of simply detecting whether gene flow occurred, the method can determine which population was likely the source and which was the recipient. By applying this approach to genomic datasets such as the Simon's Genome Diversity Project and the Human Genome Diversity Panel, the researchers attempted to answer a deceptively simple question. When populations in Africa and Eurasia exchanged genes during the late Middle Paleolithic, which direction did that exchange primarily take? The results of the analysis were mind-boggling because they did not match the expectations derived from the traditional model of human expansion. If the classic out-of-Africa narrative were broadly correct, one would expect to see strong evidence of migration from African populations into Eurasia during the critical window between roughly 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. Yet when the authors estimated migration rates across time, they consistently observed the opposite pattern. The models inferred substantial migration from the ancestors of Eurasian populations into African populations during the late Middle Paleolithic, particularly within a time range roughly spanning 30,000 to 70,000 years ago. In contrast, the inferred migration in the opposite direction during that same period was considerably weaker. This pattern appeared consistently across multiple African populations analyzed in the study and across different genomic datasets. The implication is that populations ancestral to present-day Eurasians were not simply the recipients of African migrants, but were themselves contributing genetic material back into Africa during this period of human history. Even more surprising was the scale of this back migration signal. By integrating migration rates through time, the researchers calculated a quantity known as the integrated migration fraction, which estimates the proportion of ancestral lineages in a population that pass through another population during a given time interval. When this measure was applied to major African language groups, including Niger-Kordofanian and Nilo-Saharan populations that represent large portions of the African continent today, the results suggested that roughly a third of the ancestral lineages in these populations traced through the Proto-Eurasian population identified in the model. In other words, approximately 30 to 40% of the genetic ancestry of many modern African populations may have passed through populations outside Africa before returning to the continent. Such a finding is remarkable because it implies that the genetic history of Africa cannot be understood solely as an isolated evolutionary process occurring within the continent itself. Instead, Africa appears to have been part of a much larger network of interacting populations spanning both Africa and Eurasia during the late Middle Paleolithic. To understand why this conclusion is so unexpected, it is important to consider the identity of the migrating population. The study's results indicate that the source population for the back migration was ancestral to all present-day non-African groups, meaning it existed before the divergence between Eastern and Western Eurasian lineages, such as Europeans and East Asians. Genetic evidence places that divergence roughly 40,000 years ago, which implies that the migration detected in the model must have occurred before this split. This means the migrants were not Europeans, East Asians, or any other recognizable modern population. Instead, they belonged to an earlier population that can be described as Proto-Eurasian, a group that had already diverged from African populations but had not yet diversified into the regional populations familiar today. The presence of such a population in the late Middle Paleolithic is itself intriguing because the traditional narrative of human evolution assumes that large-scale Eurasian populations emerged only after the main out-of-Africa expansion. Yet here the genetic data appear to indicate the existence of a population outside Africa that was already large and influential enough to contribute substantial ancestry back into African populations tens of thousands of years ago. One of the most interesting consequences of this interpretation involves a long-standing puzzle in population genetics concerning the apparent size of ancestral African populations during the period around 100,000 years ago. Previous studies using demographic inference methods often produced estimates suggesting unusually large effective population sizes in Africa during this time, a result that puzzled researchers because it seemed inconsistent with other lines of evidence. Many scientists proposed that this inflation might reflect complex population structure within Africa itself, meaning that multiple, partially isolated groups were contributing to the genetic diversity observed today. The new study offers a different explanation. When migration from Eurasian populations into Africa is explicitly included in the demographic model, the inflated population size estimates disappear, indicating that the previous signal of unusually large African populations may have been an artifact produced by unmodeled gene flow from outside the continent. In other words, the genetic diversity observed in African populations may partly reflect ancestry that originated outside Africa and then migrated into Africa. Feel free to rewind the video and watch again to let this sink in. The migration signal also varies significantly among African populations, suggesting that the back migration event did not affect the continent uniformly. The strongest signal appears in West African populations such as the Yoruba, while Central African hunter-gatherers such as the Mbuti and Biaka show intermediate levels of Eurasian ancestry. The Khoisan populations of southern Africa, who represent some of the deepest diverging lineages within modern human genetic diversity, show the lowest levels of the inferred migration. This pattern fits a scenario in which migrating populations entered Africa through northern or northeastern corridors and spread gradually across the continent, interacting with some populations more extensively than others. Groups that diverged early or remained geographically isolated would have received less of the incoming ancestry, leaving them with a genetic profile closer to the ancestral African population before the migration occurred. Another intriguing aspect of the results concerns the relationship between this back migration and the well-known episodes of interbreeding between modern humans and archaic hominins such as Neanderthals. One might expect that if populations from Eurasia migrated back into Africa, they might have carried Neanderthal DNA with them, since most non-African populations today possess a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. However, when the researchers examined genomic segments in African populations that likely originated from Eurasian ancestors, they found no enrichment of Neanderthal genetic material. This suggests that the back migration event either occurred before the major Neanderthal admixture events that affected Eurasian populations, or involved a population that had not yet acquired significant Neanderthal ancestry. The absence of Neanderthal signals in these segments therefore places additional constraints on the timing and nature of the migration event. Taken together, the findings paint a picture of human evolutionary history that is far more dynamic and interconnected than the classic out-of-Africa narrative implies. Rather than a single wave of migration leaving Africa and spreading across the world, the genetic evidence suggests multiple dispersals, interactions, and return migrations occurring across tens of thousands of years. Africa was not merely the origin point of modern humans, it was also a destination for populations that had previously left the continent. Eurasia was not simply a passive recipient of African migrants, but a region in which populations evolved and later contributed ancestry back into Africa. This kind of bidirectional exchange is precisely what one would expect if human populations were distributed across a broad geographic network rather than confined to a single isolated homeland. In many ways, this emerging perspective aligns with evidence from archaeology and paleoanthropology, which increasingly suggests that modern humans and closely related populations were present in multiple regions of Africa and Eurasia long before the classic out-of-Africa migration. Fossils and stone tools indicate repeated expansions and contractions of human populations across the Levant, North Africa, and southwestern Asia during periods of favorable climate. These regions likely served as corridors connecting Africa and Eurasia, allowing populations to move back and forth over long periods of time. The genetic evidence for Proto-Eurasian migration into Africa may therefore represent the genomic signature of these ancient population networks that were shaped by changing climates, shifting habitats, and the complex interactions of early human societies. The broader implication of this research is that human evolution cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of origin and expansion. The genomes of modern populations reveal a history filled with migrations, admixture events, and population splits that blur the boundaries between continents and cultures. Instead of a single origin followed by a single migration, human history appears to resemble a braided river of populations flowing across landscapes and occasionally merging before diverging again. The concept of a Proto-Eurasian population contributing ancestry back into Africa is just one example of how genetic data are reshaping our understanding of the deep past. As new analytical methods and genomic datasets continue to emerge, it is likely that even more complex patterns of migration and interaction will come to light, further dissolving the childish narratives that once dominated discussions of human origins. Ultimately, the lesson of this study is not that one model of human evolution has been definitively replaced by another. Rather, it is that the true history of our species is far richer and more intricate than the tidy diagrams found in textbooks. Human populations have always moved, mixed, separated, and reconnected across vast regions of the world. Africa, Eurasia, and other regions were linked by networks of migration long before written history began. When we examine our genomes closely enough, we begin to see the faint traces of those ancient journeys embedded within the DNA of modern populations. And those traces remind us that the story of human evolution is not a straight line, but a vast and tangled web, stretching across continents and millennia, and that we are not an African species or a Eurasian species, but only human beings. Thanks for watching. The end.